Welcome to Witham Sounding Board, a podcast sharing powerful business tips, insights, and trends for those seeking to become a rock star in their industry.
We are back at it again. I'm your host, Aaron Slaughter, and we have with us today two special guests, two of our partners from our Washington, D.C. office, Mr. Dave Dorsey and Miss Ashley Hall. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Glad to be here, Aaron.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. So you're in for a treat because these two partners have been doing this kind of work for a very long time, and we're gathered here to talk about a special type of investigation from the Department of Labor, the ICAP audits. And I guess we should start with just explaining to the listeners what exactly is a Department of Labor ICAP audit.
Yeah, good question, Aaron. So CAP stands for Compliance Audit Program, which is a program developed by OLMS. That stands for the Office of Labor Management Standards, for those who may not be familiar with that abbreviation. And basically, this program is designed to assess the compliance of unions with the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, the LMRDA. Whoa, talk about an alphabet soup of letters. Hang with me. So CAP audits, or ICAP audits, are the government's way, OLMS's way, to make sure and check in on unions and their compliance with labor laws, basically. The difference between CAP audit and an ICAP audit: a CAP audit is the program that focuses on local unions and intermediate bodies, where the ICAP audits focus on international and national unions. The bottom line with these is it's all about compliance. It's about compliance with labor laws, about compliance with union policies. It's about compliance with reporting, record keeping, and operations. Compliance.
Thank you for that explanation, Ashley. That definitely helped me understand a little bit more. But I know how my brain works. And if I'm sitting here listening to CAP audits and ICAP audits, I would love to know what triggers them. How does this thing come about? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Of course, and that is certainly the natural question, because if we know how they're triggered, we're certainly going to do what we can to avoid triggering them, that's for sure. Look, the truth is that when a union gets a letter about a CAP audit, they're not going to know why they were selected, but there's several different reasons why that might have been the case. So let me just go through a few of those. One may be that it's a phone tip that either a union member or non-member called into the DOL about concerns. We see that happen around elections, for example. It could be that financial reports like the LM2 or LM3 that's required to be reported with OLMS is not filed timely. That could send a red flag up for a CAP audit. It could be that the OLMS, when they're looking at the LM reports, may see incorrect or incomplete information and want to press into that further, or maybe they just see discrepancies that kind of raise some questions for them they want to spend some time on. So those are maybe some of the more common ones I think would trigger them, but ultimately it's up to the government to decide which ones they want to look at.
The other thing I would add to this, Aaron, is I believe that there are occasions when the Department of Labor might look into a few local unions that are affiliated with a particular national or international union. And if they find issues within those few, they may expand to other affiliates of that same union. So you might see a lot of Boilermakers, or you might see a lot of electrical workers all being done in a particular year or two because of that phenomenon. I have seen that happen as well.
Excellent. Thank you. So once an audit starts, is there any way to stop it, or is it just once it's triggered, there's nothing you can do about it except comply with requests?
Much of that, you're not going to be able to stop the process. Your best course of action is to comply with the process and be very communicative with the investigator in answering their questions, providing their documents, giving them access, answering any of their follow-up questions. Yep.
If I was going to sort of add a contemporary thought to that, with the government going through some of the changes that it's going through right now, whether it's through the DOL program or through other changes, it's quite possible that through a budget cut or some other kind of cut, that the headcount at the department might change. And that might, perhaps a lucky local union out there might not have an audit followed up on because, the person decided to retire, or they left service from the Department of Labor for another reason. I don't think that's likely, but I could see that happening.
And Ashley, I heard you mention that there was almost someone could report through a tip. That almost seems as if it's not fair. Do the tips have to be right, or is it just they're looking for information any way that they can get it? And once the powers that be come in, that's just what it is?
Once that investigator starts an investigation, they're going to see it through until they feel they've reached a conclusion. If it's coming from it's up to the investigators to really determine whether the tip is one that merits an investigation or not. I can't speak to whether every tip triggers an audit. That seems unlikely, but we don't have insight to that part of this process.
I can share that based on the little birdies that I've heard over the years, if I could put little birdies in air quotes, that the government pays attention when somebody complains. They may not act initially, but if they start to get a couple of complaints that sort of depict the same kind of behavior, I have heard that those will trigger an actual official inquiry, as opposed to just sort of you're on the radar screen. If we see something else, then we're going to propose that we pay you a visit.
Got it. Got it. So what I'm hearing, and if I'm interpreting this correctly, is we just want to make sure that all of your forms are in compliance and you have everything where it needs to be and filed on time, and that there aren't any consistencies. And then we can just try to do all that we can to make sure that we stay off of the radar.
Yes.
Sorry.
So we've talked a little bit about what these audits are. We've also talked about what would trigger these types of audits. Can you speak at all to what happens once they come in and how the process works for when you're under an investigation like this?
So generally what we see is that the investigator is going to make a phone call to a union official, usually the secretary, treasurer, or treasurer, in order to discuss and introduce the audit and discuss some of the arrangements and logistics around it. That's followed up by a letter that confirms some of the things that were discussed on that initial phone call and the information that they're going to be asking for. So you'll see a document request list. There'll be a financial questionnaire attached to it. Once that information goes to the union under audit, what I've seen is that the investigator will come on site to do an initial interviews. I've seen that last several hours. And then it goes into the fieldwork process, which is where that investigator is pulling and reviewing support that they requested and that the unions provided. So there'll be some amount of time until the follow-up questions from the investigator stop. That can vary. There's no set time. There's not a defined timeline that the investigator needs to follow. But eventually, once the investigator's questions have stopped and they feel that they've exhausted everything, all their procedures and what they want to look at, they will come back to the union officials with a draft of their closing letter, which is the officer's opportunity to be able to see what the preliminary findings are and provide some more information if that's relevant before ultimately the letter is finalized, which at that point it becomes publicly available on the OLMS website.
And Aaron, if I was going to comment in terms of duration, I think small locals, meaning very small locals, this could be done in one day. Others I've seen last nearly a year because the locals are complicated. The records may not be in the greatest of shape. One other thing I wanted to comment is there's a lot of waiting in this process. You'll get a request for information and the due date is like tomorrow. And it's like, I haven't heard from you in 3 months, and you gather this stuff together, ask for it, and now you want it tomorrow. And why is that? Well, these investigators are working on multiple investigations at the same time. And so, they're not just working on your engagement. And so that's why many times you'll send data to them and you won't hear from them for weeks at a time. It'd be nice if they acknowledged. It'd be nice if they did this and nice if they did that. But they're from the government and they're to accomplish their goals and their objectives, not necessarily to make you feel good about the process. So it can take some time, and folks should just be prepared for that and be aware of it, because sometimes that time creates a little bit of uneasiness within the membership. If they know that the DOL's here and they've been here for months, they can start to raise issues that aren't even there. And so you just need to be aware that that can happen if you're not careful.
Sure. Thank you. So in the beginning part, is there any sort of acceptance that has to happen on the part of the unions? Is there a way to challenge or even rebut in the beginning part, or is it just once you're in it, you're in it?
Once you're in it, you're in it.
So we're talking about once you're in it, and we have to comply. You got to go forward with this. What are some of the things that the powers that be are going to ask for when they come in to do this type of investigation?
The investigator's document request list is going to be familiar to those who are listening that do a financial statement audit every year. The requests are similar, though the DOL would ask for more information than maybe the financial statement auditor would. But for those who are maybe not familiar with that process, they're basically going to be asking for information that supports financial balances and transactions on the LM report that the investigator's looking at, and a lot of internal information about membership and operations. So maybe I could just run through a few things as an example, Aaron, just to bring some color to that.
Absolutely.
For example, they're going to look for things like ask for things like bank and investment statements with proof of who the authorized account signers are. They'll look for inventory records for things like gift cards, giveaways, swag, stuff like that. They'll ask for operational procedures that are available, insurance policies. They'll ask for a receipts journal, which, by the way, that receipts journal, they're going to want to see the date that the checks were received, which may or may not be the same date as they're deposited. So you just want to make sure your receipts journal includes that field. On the disbursement side, they're going to be looking for invoices. Remember, the DOL wants to make sure that every dollar that goes out of the union is supported by documented authorization of the expenditure. So they're going to be looking for that. They want to see voided checks, and that the voided checks that happened during the year are on hand and properly safeguarded against theft or abuse. They'll ask for lost time, claims, vouchers, and support, payroll records, and approval of compensation. On the membership side, membership dues records, CBAs, membership applications, they're going to ask for minutes. So the document request list is usually a few pages long in addition to the questionnaire, which is several pages long. So it's a good bit of information, but hopefully that gives folks a flavor of the kind of things they'd be expecting to hear from the investigator as far as what they're looking for.
And as a little bit of an add-on here, unions are required under the law to retain records for 5 years after they file their annual LM report. And so generally the investigators will focus on the current year and the prior year. And if they see anything of concern, they'll go back. And the question is, how far can they go back? Well, generally speaking, a union is supposed to have records going back 5 years, plus the year that you actually filed the form. So they can and often will go back looking for things like record retention just to make sure that you're able to bring it up. So unions that tend to switch software can sometimes run into a problem because they might have abandoned an accounting system software 2 years ago. And now the Department of Labor wants to get access into those records. And so we suggest that unions that change software consider how much of those reports can we convert into a PDF so that we can bring them up later if the government ever asks us for that. Because otherwise, the government's perspective is going to be, we're not responsible for getting the software. You, the union, is responsible for keeping the records in a format that we can look at them. And you need to be able to do that. And whatever cost is involved in making that happen is on the union to carry.
Well, it certainly sounds like those listings are extensive and there are a ton of documents and requests that are going to be made. I'm going to ask the $1 million question here. In both of your opinions, what happens if you can't produce something that they've asked for?
Likely going to be a finding that they'll report as part of being a record retention, an instance of noncompliance in the area of record retention. That being said, they'll ask for some policies aren't necessarily required by law, right? So they'll ask for it because if you have it, they want to see that you follow it. But if you don't have it, and as long as it's not a requirement, then that's okay. So it really depends on what it is that they're asking for that you're not able to provide. If you're not able to provide, for example, support for a disbursement, or maybe, for example, credit card receipts don't have all the data that they're expecting, those kinds of things would likely result in findings that'll show up in that closing letter.
Yeah, so under the law, Title 206 of the LMRDA mandates this record retention period of 5 years. And Ashley's absolutely correct that they're looking for everything. And, those who operate under the IRS rules, whether you have all the receipts or not, maybe that's not such a big deal. But the Department of Labor on the union side says every transaction requires written documentation. And you need to find, and if you don't, then they write the closing letters in a way that are not particularly positive. And let's say that you had 22 credit card charges that didn't have a receipt. They're going to say 22 violations of Title 206 in their letter. And it reads very, very harsh. So they're not there trying to do what maybe your financial statement auditor does in their management letter comments, which says, hey, here's an area that you can improve. Instead, they're there to report the violations of the law. And it reads that way. So it's hard not to feel bad when you may have a couple little nitpicks here and there when you get the letter, because it's not meant to try to beef up your ego. It's meant to remind you that compliance is important and these are the rules.
Well, thank you for that. And for all who are listening and interested, we do have some articles that we've written on our website if you want to see a little additional information. For all our listeners out there, you could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that. See you next time for more hot topics, and thanks to Dave and Ashley for giving us their time and their thoughts.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you'll be first in line to hear what's coming next. Don't want to wait for our next episode? Check us out at withum.com. That's WITHUM.com.